Welcome to the American Classroom Podcast. I'm Jared Taylor with my co-host, Lindsey Crosland. How are you this morning?
I'm good.
Okay.
Doing well. Yeah.
We're going to talk about civics this morning. Kind of the heart and soul of what the idea of the podcast is, right? How do we grow good American citizens? And what's the role of the public school system or the private school system, the American classroom, in doing that?
Yeah. Do you want to kind of introduce the article you found, and maybe we can talk about how civic literacy ties to civility?
Yeah, because we shared a link on a chamber article. So this is U.S. Chamber of Commerce. They did a study February of this year. So we're recording this August of 2024. This came out February of 2024 for those that might be listening to it in the future. One of the reasons they did that is because the United States of America is preparing for the 250th anniversary of our country. Big birthday party.
Yeah, way cool.
Yeah, so we'll have to cover that in a future podcast about some of the celebrations that are happening in Philadelphia and across the country. So that'll be great because the American classroom needs to participate in that birthday party.
Definitely.
Bring cupcakes. Okay, so here's what it says. A comprehensive new study from the U.S. Chamber reveals an alarming truth just 3 years shy of America's 250th anniversary. The nation's civic knowledge is badly lagging. It's kind of their punchline. The survey examined 2,000 registered voters and shows while Americans lack basic understanding of government, but the trust in business remains strong. So they're contrasting their knowledge of government is very low, but they do trust business. Now, this is coming from the chamber, so that helps, and we'll kind of get into why that is. I guess they had a test. It was a pretty basic civic literacy test, and most people couldn't answer some of the basic things. Here's a couple of things that they threw out. 2/3 of Americans say they studied civics in high school, but only a quarter of them are very confident they could even explain our system today. Okay.
Well, it says the survey finds more than 70% of Americans fail a basic civic literacy quiz.
Yeah. So what's a basic civic literacy quiz? It's it's probably the same one or very close to the one that an immigrant would take if they'd like to be naturalized.
So branches of government, number of Supreme Court justices, some basic functions of our democracy.
Yeah. So it's really, if someone wants to come be an American citizen, the literacy test just says, do you know the rules of the game? Do you know how to play this game called the United States of America? That's effectively what it is.
Yeah, when we were talking earlier, I really liked your analogy. Can you kind of describe that, like how you compare? Like, why is it important that Americans have some basic civic education? Why does that matter? And I like how you compared it to a game just now. Can you kind of describe that?
Yeah. I mean, how do you win a game if you don't know the rules, right? And you have the basic rules of the game. Let's say you play Monopoly. And okay, you roll and you move and you pick up houses and things like that. And so you have the basics of it. And then you have a whole nother level of the game. It's like, well, what are the ways to actually win? What are the strategies that win? You don't just buy random properties or things like that, right? You cluster. And so there's kind of two levels of how it works. And this literacy test is really just the basics of it, right? Do you know the basics of the U.S. government and how it works, at least at the federal level? There's probably another quiz that should happen at the local level, but at least at the federal level. Then, yeah.
So I like that analogy for the purpose of our founders set up our the Constitution outlines a government that we all succeed, right? We all win. So I just like the comparison to a game, not saying that there's some sort of special strategy, except that we're just all educated in how our government was designed, that we all thrive.
Yeah, and that's a good way to look at it. Like the Constitution is really the rules of the game. That's what it is. But the spirit of America really comes through in the Declaration. So, to use the game analogy, you can have a game of football, right? You know the basics of blocking and tackling and the boundary lines, things like that. That's kind of more like what the Constitution is. But all of that's resting on the basic ideas of our country, which is self-government, individual liberty, individual rights, where those came from, things like that. Why we have our own identity as Americans, right? Why should we break away from England? Things like that. So, and that's like in a football game where you would just compare it to, well, what kind of an offense do you run? What kind of a defense do you run, right? Those are higher order type thinking.
I like it.
So anyways, so they there's another study that came out actually just last month kind of the same topic and themes. Thought I'd just throw this in here, and then maybe we'll talk about like why this is happening here. This came out from American Council of Trustees and Alumni, and it largely was looking at college students. But they kind of asked the same basic thing. But here's some of the punchline. It published a document called Losing America's Memory 2.0, is what they called it. And we'll link to this in the show notes. 60% of students do not know the term length of members of the U.S. Congress. Okay. 35% know that Mike Johnson is the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Only 35%. Okay. Roughly a third. Now, this is 2024. That may change, but Mike Johnson is currently the Speaker of the House. Only 37% know that John Roberts is the Supreme Court's Chief Justice. Only 27% correctly identify Kamala Harris as the President of the U.S. Senate. So right now, as we're sitting here, Kamala Harris is the Vice President of the United States. Joe Biden is the President. Kamala Harris is running to be President as Joe Biden dropped out a couple weeks ago. But as the Vice President, she is also the President of the Senate, which is the point they're kind of making here.
Gotcha.
So,
was this a multiple choice question survey of the audience?
I don't know.
Or was it, did they have to like write in who the people are? It's interesting. Yeah, like, did they have some help? Like 37%. Was it 37%?
Yeah, it's basically only a third
passed.
of our college students know the rules of the game. And so there was a couple of interesting comments that came out of this. Like, many Americans choose to not pay much attention to political life and just don't have a strong understanding of history. And sadly, I agree with that. I think that is true. When you look at voter turnout rates in local elections, you only get about 20 or 30%. Now, I know we're crossing federal or local, but still, the engagement level of the American citizen is very, very low with regards to knowledge. And I think that lack of knowledge and confidence in the rules of the game translates into the ballot box.
I can see that.
Yeah, can you see that? Just one other little thing, and then maybe we'll talk about some of the attitudes. I just thought this was interesting. This comes from Jonathan Zimmerman, historian, University of Pennsylvania. If we don't understand government, we can't govern ourselves. That's pretty simple.
And I was going to say, like, let's talk about the detriment to lack of civic literacy. So if people aren't educated, then how do we govern ourselves?
Yeah. And this whole idea of America relies on that basic concept, and only a third really know at least the basics of it. I mean, how many of those know the concepts and the beauty of the ideas in the Declaration of Independence?
I also feel like being educated in these areas inspires us to be more engaged in our local and state, communities. I've heard you talk on our, say in our previous episodes about being a resident versus being a citizen, right? If you're just coming home at the end of the day and pulling into your driveway and closing the garage door and keeping to yourself and doing your own thing, and not really participating in your community or helping, I really do feel like this inspires us to participate more in our citizenship. As an individual, as a family, to be more engaged. And so I don't know if you wanted to speak about that at all
super
from
important.
Your own personal experience.
I think that's a huge, huge point, because more people probably know when Taylor Swift is going to drop the next song than when they know when their next election is. But what impacts their life more directly? Well, that's an easy one, right? And so, and we get it. Politics are boring. They're nasty. They're ugly. It's hard to tell, like, who's lying to you, because you kind of feel like everybody's lying to you. And so I can see why there's a little maybe disenchantment with it, because
it's more exciting to know when Taylor Swift's album's coming out.
Yeah, exactly.
At least my 14-year-old would say so.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, but in order to turn the ship around, I think we need to know some of the underlying issues to it. And I want to just highlight a couple of those, and maybe we can talk about that, because I think if you see the root cause, then you can really address it. And you touched on this as well. This really isn't solely a K-12 problem, which is our podcast is largely about the K-12 classroom. It's a systems problem. It's a systemic issue in our country, right? The kitchen table should have more dialogue about civics and the importance of participation and being a vibrant, active, participating resident and citizen.
Right. Like, how do we fix this? Where does it start?
Yeah.
Is the K-12 system doing its job, and then it's in college when things kind of fall off. I know that's where a lot of the surveys were done. But
let me throw out a couple things, and I want to hear your comments on it. Okay. One is shifting priorities in education. Okay. One of the big priorities that's shifted, and largely you can point to Common Core under the Obama administration that did this. It shifted the focus of K-12 from more of the classical liberal arts, where you have strong content-based curriculum in English language arts, mathematics, science, to more career-oriented. It's very much a workforce development curriculum, set of standards. It's not curriculum, it's standards. But the curriculum has to line up to it because, states now have to require that in order to get all the federal funding. So that shifted the American classroom away from some of the basics and emphasis that they could have done because they had to put more college and career readiness in.
Okay.
Comments?
No, I can see that.
Yeah, I can see that. Okay. I would say one other point is somehow there's, and I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing, I'm just saying it's taking time away from civic education, is programs like International Baccalaureate and more trying to raise global citizens. And you and I have a lot of experience overseas, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. We definitely need to be good global citizens. We need to know how to interact with our neighbors and things like that. I'm just pointing out that it's just taking time. I mean, there's only so much time that a teacher has to cover so much material. And sometimes that'll push away or maybe deprioritize the American experience over others because we try to have a moral equivalence between nations. And we definitely should treat everybody the same and fairly and things like that. But there are some countries that behave better and have more prosperous economics and more human rights in their countries than others. And to say that they all treat themselves fairly and their governments are good of themselves, I'm not sure that's the most educated position. Some of their citizens are absolutely downright abused, and that is pretty easy to show in certain places.
I think you brought up global citizenship. I found an article in the College Fix, and this is related to college. But historian Wilfred McClay said K-12 and higher education shift to an emphasis on global citizenship rather than national and local citizenship has led to ignorance about what he calls the common treasure of America's Republican self-government. So his argument is that there's no such thing as global leadership, and it's leading to a neglect of the areas of citizenship that are most meaningful. So I think there's arguments for both, right? Should we be emphasizing in the classroom global citizenship, or really focus on like what you were describing as just like your local citizenship? Yeah,
and the idea of a global citizen is, I don't know. It sounds really good, but there really isn't the same. You're comparing apples to oranges. Citizenship actually means something. There's boundaries, there's rights, duties, privileges, things like that. If you have a global government, then you have global citizenship, and that's a whole nother discussion for it. But yeah, I think we're both agreed that being a good participant and recognizing the good and value in all nations is of supreme importance to being an American.
Right. And I feel like as we travel and go visit other countries, that we should always be cognizant of what we're bringing there, that we leave it kind of better than that we found it. So I feel like those are our responsibilities as we travel, whether it's for business or for recreation or leisure. So, yeah. Okay,
let's go to another one that people point to as a reason why we're losing this basic content and basic fluency of the American ideal. And that is the emphasis of critical thinking over just basic knowledge and facts. And we hear that, and I think I've told you the story in the past. A friend of our family was a college professor, and he had this student come up to him one day, and he said, "Hey, I hear that you just make us memorize things. I came to college to learn how to think." And he turned to him and he says, "Really? You came here to learn how to think?" "Yeah, I don't want you just to shove all these facts down in these years and everything I want to learn to think." And he turned to him and he says, "Well, what do you expect to think with?" And so, that's a good story that balances. You got to have both. right? You need some basic scientific knowledge. Like, we just had a great podcast with Mr. Burrell, right? You have to know your math facts before you can start to use them to apply into story problems, or you have to know basic scientific principles to be able to run lab tests,
right?
Things like that.
Information, education.
Yeah.
But you should be using critical thinking skills while you're collecting that information or data.
Yeah, but sometimes I think the pendulum swings too far over to critical thinking and leaves out basic content. That's why people don't know that. And if they're not, and granted, how many years you serve in Congress is kind of boring. There's no question about that. How old do you have to be to run for Senate? Things like that. It's definitely more interesting to talk about the substantive meaning of things. And so both have to do it, but I think the pendulum needs to swing back a little bit more. And definitely in the early grades, K-8, those grades are when children really need that base content knowledge. Their minds aren't really ready, especially when they're under 8 or 9 years old. Children's psychologists have affirmed this over and over again. They're not ready for conceptual learning. Their brains just aren't there yet. They're ready for concrete information, and that's why the K3 space is so good for content knowledge. Just build that base, and there's different ways to do that. And then you can start to layer in a little bit more conceptual when they are able to actually do that. And then they're not as frustrated about it. But okay, maybe just one more here. Get your comments on this. Because they point to other things like they don't know because of they don't have a lot of exposure to primary sources, and thought that was interesting. But here's the one: the impact of social media and fake news. Right, the constant stream of information and misinformation. People get confused, and so they just pull out. I saw a post on Facebook, just the other day, and it was basically this. It was someone that said they were talking about a certain proposition on the general plan for a city, and someone commented and says, unless I really understand it, I just vote no. And I thought, okay, well, that's interesting, because how do they really sift through that? And that's kind of a normal voter, right? We have busy lives, and when you get some complex thing to vote on like that, are you going to really take all the time to do that? Well, you should. It does impact your life. But I don't know, how do you see teachers, helping our young people kind of sift through this huge wave of information? Our children have never seen this before.
Yeah, it is a really big topic. I feel like we need our own episode about it. But as far as social media, it's interesting because you can post a clip of somebody finishing a sentence or making a statement that's completely out of context. And so they can share that over social media, and then someone says, oh, that candidate stands for this because they said that. So it's important to know in what context it was spoken and delivered and what they're talking about. So I feel like, but those sound bites might be helpful to get youth, adults to interact and be interested in what they said, versus they might not be watching the live stream of something happening in, legislation. So I feel like having those little bits on social media are helpful and harmful. So I'm hoping that teachers and professors can encourage their students to click the link to see the whole meeting or to hear the full idea. Don't just take sound bites and then believe it. And then, like you said, we hear so many different bits of information that we've started to assume that most of the stuff that's posted is false.
And even the fact checkers are now political. You have right-leaning fact checkers and left-leaning fact checkers.
So frustrating.
Yeah, so I think that one of the takeaways is the American classroom needs to help our young people discern between trashy data and, how do you sift through it all? And the only other thing I would add is I think one thing that really helps people sort it out is when they understand basic principles. And it kind of goes back to the other point. If you understand basic factual knowledge, it's like John Adams says, you can have your own opinions, but you can't have your own facts, right? People will like to put out alternate facts, quote unquote. But if people understand some basic principles that are time-tested and proven, then when something comes up that challenges that idea, they can use that principle to know whether that issue or proposition or candidate is going to expand their freedom or contract their freedom. So here's an example. So one example is all men are created equal, right? That is a fundamental principle in the Declaration of Independence. So when a bill comes out and says, well, we're going to treat this business this way, this big business this way, or this small business this way, or this individual this way, or this type of person that way, right? You and I know, hey, all men are created equal, right? We should treat everybody fairly. Then you can tell if that policy or that candidate is, on point with the ideas of liberty and freedom and what America is based on, or they're not, right? So anyways, I think that might help as well. But anything you want to add on that?
No, I just think it's just important to dig deeper. Like, I've even had a family member send me a little bar graph. It was a snippet with a title that said, like, it was relative to gun violence. And I hate gun violence. It's so sad that anyone ever dies from a weapon. But the numbers were so shocking. I mean, the post was meant to create like this reaction that you're like, I will vote against anyone that, won't control this. But when I wanted to see the data and where it was coming from. And then as I did, I found that it was like not quite, the bar graph wasn't showing what it was, what the intention of the message going with it. Yeah. And so it was inaccurate, or I would say like misinformation. Anyway, so I just feel like looking at the information and finding out where it came from and understanding it correctly, or, maybe the majority of that was coming from a mental health issue rather than actually accessibility to a weapon issue or whatever it is, trying to understand the facts. And so that's my last comment about this.
Yeah, it's like the old phrase says, statistics don't lie, but liars use statistics.
Oh, I haven't heard that.
Never heard that one before.
But yeah.
But I mean, we do need to understand that people can really twist things to their advantage and push certain agendas, and Americans need to be educated on that, and they need to know how to sort things out, discern things that'll help, protect our rights, expand our freedoms and liberties, and promote. And
then know where to like take action, right? Like, well, what do I do to stop that, or what can I do? Yeah. But anyway, that's why it really is important to know who to vote for when voting day is.
Yeah, and maybe we should go to a little more fundamental, like, why are we taking time to talk about this, right? At the end of the day, the taxpayer is paying for public schools, charter or district, to educate their children to be Americans, right? And to live in this land of freedom and prosperity. I mean, how lucky are we? And the founders were united in saying that you have to have an educated citizenry to work to play this game, right? Going back to the initial point. Yeah. But I think if you just take the flip of what we just talked about, right, focusing on content knowledge and the classical liberal arts, what's good about things, working on the inside person, rather than everything be focused on career development, right? There's a place for that. It should be in schools, and we're not saying it shouldn't be, right? But bring back the preeminence of understanding basic content of American citizenry and how does this game work called America.
Okay, so one of the questions I posed at the beginning is, do you think that civic literacy translates in any way to civility in a country?
In some ways, yeah. I think it absolutely does. Because if you agree on basic facts, it's so much easier to have a conversation with people. But if you can't agree on basic facts, then it's difficult, right? For example, a couple of years ago, one of the last things that former President Trump did was he published the 1776 curriculum for American history to try to address this issue. I think it was prior to that, somebody came out with the 1619 Project. You fact check me here on the date. I think it was called the 1619 Project. And it was basically to reframe the American history discussion about that is when the American experience started, because that's when the slave trade was really ramping up. So again, if you can't agree on basic facts, like when's the birthday of our country, right? It's really difficult. But so yeah, and civic literacy does give you the fluency and just the basic vocabulary, because once you do that, then you can do that. But also when we talk about classical liberal arts, we learn about respect. And that's part of what an educated American does, is they see different viewpoints and they can hold those in their head at the same time without your head blowing up.
Right. And
yeah, what
especially in our country, just the understanding that we're all created equal. And so if you move forward throughout your day, reminding yourself that we're all created equal, no matter, like you said, whatever comes up or disagreements you have, that you can just treat everyone with kindness and civility. Yeah,
people have a chance to, or they should have a chance to give them their day in court, right? Give them a good chance to have a say. And so I think it was an interesting thing, and it's interesting that 2 of these studies dropped in the same year. I'm not sure that they're tied to this is an election year, those that are listening to this in the future, but I don't know that they're necessarily tied to that. But hopefully people who are listening to this will take this and take a look at some of the show notes. And if you're looking for a school that really, if you're looking for a school that you would like to have a very rich American history experience, a good government experience, here's a couple of tips, what we covered today on how to look for a school. Go visit, go see what their curriculum is. You have every right as a parent, as a tax-paying parent, to pull their curriculum and talk to their teachers, or just see what the teacher profile looks like, what their background is. Talk to some of the alumni and see what their experience is. I don't know, anything that you would add for the listeners that might want to learn more or take action?
No, I agree with that. I think asking them to see the curriculum, which you have a right to see, and then how often is it brought up throughout the school year? Is it just one day, right? Or is it integrated into all of it? That's one thing I appreciate here about Heritage Academy is they have a citizenship class every single day, opposite of their lunch period. And so, whether it's just throughout the semester or it's every single day, I think it's important to ask your child's school how often they're introducing these things.
Yeah, what are they doing? We need to get past patriotism as all about fireworks. Fireworks and hot dogs, right? There's more to America than that, which is great. But and I'm glad you mentioned Heritage and what they do, and that is a fabulous program that they have, and the enrichment that they have to study the life of Washington for a full year, understand his thoughts and ideas. Very, very powerful. But those that are listening, if you'll notice on the American Classroom icon, we have a picture of Lincoln and Washington up there, right? Because we believe that citizenship is one of the preeminent features of an American classroom. And so we hope that this little discussion and these ideas will help you get some ideas for how to benefit your children, your community, and your classroom if you're a teacher. So thanks for listening, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.